Today's show is sponsored by MongoDB. As a programmer, you think in objects. With MongoDB, so does your database. MongoDB is the most popular document database built for modern application developers and the cloud era. Millions of developers use MongoDB today to power the world's most innovative products and services, from cryptocurrency to online gaming, IoT, and much more. Try MongoDB today with Atlas, the global cloud database service that runs on AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. Configure, deploy, and connect to your database in just a few minutes. Check it out today at mongodb.com/atlas. That's mongodb.com/atlas.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is good to be back with all of you. It is now February of 2020, the second month of 2020. Hope everybody's doing well. Before we get started with Cloud News of the Week, I want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to everybody who made a donation, made a contribution to the Krispy Kreme Challenge, the Donut Run, as we call it, out there helping the families and kids who are helped by the North Carolina Children's Hospital, our annual fundraiser. So we raised nearly $4,000, just a few pennies short of $4,000. So thank you to everybody who generously reached into their pocket and made a contribution that's going to make a big difference in somebody's life. It's going to make a difference in a kid's life and helps the families of those children who are unfortunately dealing with some really tough sickness issues and health issues. So as always, thank you so much. We're always incredibly honored to represent the community, and the community, as always, came through and represented for the Cloudcast. So thank you so much to everybody who made a difference. Now, as we get into Cloud News of the Week, it's sort of a Groundhog's Day theme. We are, the Super Bowl just finished. First week in February also means Groundhog's Day. And as always happens around Groundhog's Day, we have earnings announcements. And with AWS and Amazon and Azure and Microsoft doing their earnings announcements, it was a little bit of Groundhog's Day. We did continue to see those businesses continue to grow. We did continue to see them have fairly healthy growth numbers. So let's dive into that a little bit. In terms of Amazon, they announced their AWS numbers. The numbers came in just a hair under $10 billion for the quarter. So AWS is now run rate of about a $40 billion business. So pretty amazing growth from the last 10 years. Now, the one thing about that growth is while the top line numbers do continue to grow, and it does continue to be a very, very healthy business, and by all means, the number one cloud computing business out there, we did see those numbers in terms of growth percentage continue to tick down. So growth rates were around 33, 34%, depending on whose calculations you were looking at. And that's about the either fifth, sixth, or seventh quarter in a row of slowing growth numbers as a percentage. And obviously, part of that is going to be the laws of big numbers. It's difficult to continue to grow big numbers over and over again. I do find it a little bit humorous that the super hardcore AWS fans out there like to get really upset at the financial analysts for doing a poor job of forecasting how much AWS is going to grow, as if Amazon is not the company that manipulates Wall Street probably more than anybody in terms of making sure that their stock grows, even though anyways, won't go into that. But I always think that's a little bit funny when they get mad that people think that their growth numbers are off, and it's Wall Street's fault that they have to predict them in the future, and they shouldn't have to do those sort of things. So anyways, AWS continues to grow, a little bit slower in terms of percentage growth, but still kind of the behemoth in public cloud. And on the flip side, Microsoft announced their earnings. Their earnings numbers were very, very strong. They still have the stigma of not really breaking out their Azure numbers. So they sort of break them out. There's still some speculation that they're not nearly as transparent or clean as AWS in terms of breaking out their numbers. But their growth numbers were up. Their growth numbers were up about 62% in terms of growth. The speculation is the Azure business is probably about half the size of the AWS business, probably about a $20 billion Azure business. But again, continuing to grow. And I want to go back and do a little bit of homework, go back and look at, when AWS was a $20 billion business, what were its growth rates versus, let's say, Azure now is a $20 billion business at a 62% growth rate. So interesting to watch both of those. I think the big takeaway for, us taking a look at these is, just continue to see more and more growth in the public cloud. We are very much beginning to see the market signaling that competition is something they desire. They are spreading their spend across multiple clouds, and and Azure is very much becoming a competitor. They are, definitely number two. I'm sure, they would like to become number one at some point. We'll see if they ever have the ability to overtake AWS. But very interesting to sort of watch that come together. Last piece of cloud news of the week, big in terms of just sort of historical trends and passing of the torch. But IBM announced that Ginny Rometty, who is the CEO of IBM and has been for the last almost a decade, I believe now, is going to be stepping down as CEO. She will be continuing to maintain a board role and some role with IBM on their board. But Arvind Krishna will be the new CEO of IBM. He joins, he doesn't join. He's been with IBM for quite a while. He's been running their cloud computing and cognitive software business for quite a while now. So he steps up into the CEO role, and the former CEO of Red Hat, Jim Whitehurst, is taking over as president of IBM and will continue to be CEO of Red Hat. But interesting to watch that transition happen. Very, very interesting to see, now the heads of a lot of the really big tech companies. So Google Cloud, IBM, Microsoft, now run by sort of first generation Americans, immigrants and so forth. So, very interesting trend to see happen. It's always interesting when, a major CEO steps down, somebody else takes over, some new leadership, some new ideas. So it'll be interesting to watch IBM and how they try and transition that business themselves as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap up Cloud News of the Week. Hope everybody is doing well and excited to talk about one of our favorite topics, serverless, as we get to that right after the break. Today's episode is sponsored by Datadog, a modern, full-stack monitoring platform for cloud infrastructure, applications, and log metrics all in one place. From the recent report on serverless adoption and trends released this week, Datadog found that half of their customer base using EC2 have now adopted AWS Lambda, 50%. Datadog also examined real-world serverless usage by thousands of customers running millions of distinct serverless functions and found that half of those Lambda invocations run for less than 800 milliseconds, not very long. You too can easily monitor all your serverless functions in one place and generate serverless metrics straight from Datadog. Check it out yourself by signing up for a free 14-day trial and getting a great Datadog t-shirt. Just go to datadog.com/cloudcast. That's datadog.com/cloudcast. And we're back. Folks, as we're beginning to do these kind of kick off the 2020 shows, and we're really talking about some big topics, that we see as really important or, kind of transformational as we look ahead to the new year. One of the ones that we always want to be kind of talking about is you always have interest in for us is serverless. And we haven't had a chance to really talk about serverless all that much. I know it's a topic that it's kind of feast or famine. The people that are interested in serverless are really, really into it, and people who don't are still kind of curious. They're trying to figure out, how real is it? How much should we get involved? What are people really doing with it? And so today's going to be really interesting. We have a chance to really kind of not only dig into the topic, but kind of dig into usage. So excited to have Stephen Pinkerton, who is one of the product managers at Datadog, join us today. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So before we dive into serverless and some of the things that you do around it, give us a little bit of your background. You've had a chance to work with a number of really, really interesting companies prior to Datadog, but give us, somewhat of some of the things you've worked on and kind of some of the areas you're passionate about.
I started my career at Facebook when I was in high school, and I was working a lot of IT automation. So they were buying Macs by the pallet full and needed a way to automatically set them up. So I was doing a lot of scripting around that. And this was kind of at the point before we had tools like Fleetsmith and before you could run like Chef or Puppet really on a Mac. And so I pivoted from there into doing more web application development, and then spent some time working at companies like Square and Nest doing embedded software. Spent some time at a startup after that called Monzo in the UK. Really, really cool company. And then got into product management, was working at Cloudflare and worked a little bit on their serverless database as well as some of their 1.1.1.1 features. So kind of been all over the place and all over the place and just get bored easily and like trying new things.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's always great to talk to people who not only have kind of had the experience of building some things, like you said at Monzo, one of the banks that's getting a lot of visibility for kind of building a new type of bank, but also working with the companies that are building some of these bleeding edge technologies. So very, very cool. You've been involved here recently with some some work that you've been doing in terms of looking at. So one of the great things about we've worked with Datadog for a while. One of the great things about working with them is we don't tend to talk about things kind of hypothetically. We talk about them in terms of reality because you have visibility into what your customers do, right? In terms of how you monitor it, you're able to collect information and look at trends. You've recently been looking at serverless trends. So give us a sense. You recently have published kind of a very interesting survey and paper. Give us a sense of kind of the scope of what you looked at and what were some of the big things you were trying to pull together as you looked at this sort of new survey of how people are using serverless.
Yeah, so the report was really interesting to put together because we, as PMs here, we talk to companies on every side of the spectrum, whether they're traditional tech companies, Silicon Valley tech companies, even like local national governments. And we see a lot of this data in internal dashboards, and we hear all this data anecdotally and at conferences. And this report was really an opportunity for us to like really aggregate it, but also share it with the whole serverless and open source community. So it was very interesting to put together just to officially break down like who is truly using serverless. So there were some really interesting insights when we looked at all of our customers' metrics and like their aggregated trace data. Or when we took an aggregated look at all of our customers' metrics, trace data, we're able to put together a very interesting real picture of how people are using serverless now. Some really interesting takeaways is that there's really no one segment of people or of company who are using serverless. We're really seeing it anywhere from small 4-person startups to like massive financial institutions, traditional Silicon Valley companies. It's everywhere, and it's expanded beyond hobbyist interest into so many companies that that in some interaction you have every day with an application or with a website, like you're touching something that's serverless.
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas that I think people are really trying to figure out. And I kind of mentioned in the intro, for people that are really into serverless, they don't really think of it as being new or unique anymore. It's a core part of their business. It's a core part of how they develop. But I think for a large population of people, they're just trying to figure out like, hey, who is using this? And I think what you're kind of uncovering there is, like you said, this is becoming, whether it's mainstream in terms of like everybody uses it, sort of like the number of developers. I think what you're kind of starting off with is this premise that it is becoming sort of mainstream in terms of you can pick and choose lots of different industries, lots of different size companies, probably lots of things that you as an end user might interact with. And that's always a big step, is to figure out, is this just a niche? Is it just a Silicon Valley thing? Is it out in lots of places? That seems like a really good starting premise. Let's dive into some of the highlights that you found, because the report goes into about 10 or 11 sort of highlights, but I want to hit on a few, and then we can dive into a few others. And again, we'll put this in the show notes so people can go take a look at it. One of the things, sort of to get started, that people always ask about serverless is, what type of application uses this, or is it different than my Java applications? Talk a little bit about kind of the size of applications, or sort of how long they run. What are we finding in terms of what do they look like, or how long do they execute for?
So we're seeing a lot of Lambda functions executing in less than 500 milliseconds. So they're either executing quickly to respond to user requests, or they're just part of like a long chain of Lambda functions, sort of a part of these asynchronous event-driven architectures that we're seeing really commonly. And some more data to support these kind of smaller applications, or these functions that support a larger service, is that people are allocating typically about the minimum amount of memory to their Lambda functions. So we're seeing very, very small pieces of code that are fitting together into larger applications.
Yeah. It's that sort of, I was sort of surprised about that. Mostly, I mean, the piece of them being sort of small and running for short periods of time didn't really surprise me. I mean, that was the first iteration. It could be a bot. It could be a response to a database table gets changed. I was sort of surprised, given how much we heard in the serverless community of people saying, oh, we need you to extend how long they can run for. They need to run for more than 5 minutes. And so it was interesting to see that, that's still sort of shorter execution is still kind of the bulk of what people do, even though a lot of folks were complaining about, hey, can this run for longer than 5 minutes? So again, always interesting to kind of get the feedback and versus the reality.
Yeah, and actually one of the interesting trends I've heard from talking to customers is that so the current Lambda timeout limit is 15 minutes. And so when folks are needing a longer timeout than that, they're turning to either like AWS step functions, so a way to sort of orchestrate a larger workflow with retries and with different branching logic. And those can execute for up to a year at a time, and they can be built on top of Lambdas and ECS, or they're running their applications in something like ECS where they can just control, or where they don't have a timeout limit.
Yeah, makes sense. So I want to throw in one, I don't know if it's a caveat or sort of trying to understand. So a lot of what you measured here is around AWS usage. Do you feel like you could maybe extrapolate, what people might be doing in AWS with Lambda and so forth, to maybe what's available in Azure or Google, or you're not totally sure yet if the data would kind of be relevant in the other clouds, like for Azure Functions or Google Run?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're seeing a lot of interest as well in Azure Functions, Google Cloud Functions, as well as companies still using Google App Engine. And then we're seeing a lot of interest in Google Cloud Run as well. And so it's interesting seeing, I think the questions that we get are typically different. So we're seeing people on AWS typically running like very serverless native workloads. So they're embracing step functions. They're using DynamoDB. On the Google side, we're seeing people using Firebase, Google Cloud Functions. Okay. And then on the Cloud Run side, we're seeing workloads more analogous to something that someone would run on Fargate, for example.
Okay.
And then on Azure, an interesting thing is we're seeing this trend where people are still running serverless. They really like the serverless development style where they just write code, they upload it to the cloud provider, and they don't, they're passing the pager. They don't manage anything else. I think that I think that development style is here to stay. But what's interesting on Azure or these more K-native technologies like Cloud Run is that you're still running your serverless functions on top of some kind of provisioned infrastructure. So on the Azure side, people are still running their functions on top of like app service plans where they've provisioned some infrastructure or someone at their company has. But it's really the development style that's really stuck with people and company. That's really stuck with developers.
Yeah, no, and that's helpful. And I think the thing I would probably suggest and folks take away when they take a look at the report is don't get hung up completely with the thing that's mentioned the most in this is Lambda. Obviously we're like you said, we're seeing the various cloud providers have different offerings. I think the biggest trend to take away from this is like, what are the patterns we're seeing, types of applications, types of usage, languages, and so forth. And and obviously they can reach out to folks like you to kind of go, hey, can we dig into something a little bit more? I want to dive into a little bit around languages. You highlighted basically the game is Node and Python, and while some other languages are supported, that's 80, 85, 90% of the game is really these kind of smaller footprint, simple to use types of languages, JavaScript and Python. Did that surprise you at all?
I think that's pretty consistent with what we've heard from customers. So it was very interesting to run this report and see officially that those are the runtimes that are most common. And I think it lines up with when AWS announced support for these runtimes. So Node and Python were always Node and Python were supported very early on with Lambda as a product. And then as developers wanted to move more workloads in the cloud, we see more Go and Java and Ruby as well creeping in there, and some .NET as well.
Oh, interesting. Now, one of the things that jumped out at me the most was, as we've, at least on the podcast, as we've talked to, various serverless users, right, people who are developing in this style and kind of people that really focus in this space, it was always this, hey, you're sort of, your bigger, even cloud technologies, weren't interesting to them. It was always too much to manage, and it was definitely not in your data center, but like even EC2 was like, it's a lot to deal with. I thought it was really interesting. You guys highlight that there's sort of a correlation now you can see between EC2 users, or people that were using VMs and so forth, and beginning to use serverless. So talk a little bit about kind of the correlation you're starting to see between EC2 users, VMs and compute, and serverless.
Yeah, I think the trend is really that we're seeing, as soon as people are migrating workloads into the cloud, that it's super easy to jump into all these adjacent products that can make developers' lives easier. And I don't think it's very surprising that serverless has been a big one of those. As companies are migrating their workloads into the cloud, it's really easy for them to adopt serverless and Lambda and even serverless databases. So we're really talking about serverless functions, but I think the bigger conversation here is serverless as a whole composes of functions, databases, serverless containers, and we're seeing all this adoption increasing a lot. And I think it's just because it's super easy when you're, or it's very easy to adopt for new projects. Let's see.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. I think you're kind of calling out two things. One is, the sort of connectedness. Okay, I got used to working in the cloud, kind of the way to deal with the cloud, and then I started taking advantage of Lambda because I figured out how to make that work for the business or for the application. But you're also kind of highlighting, hey, once you're in the cloud, that other service is just kind of there, right? There wasn't another requirement, or you didn't have to jump through some hoop to say, hey, can I get approval to use this? Is there some other RFP we've got to go through? You're just sort of like, hey, when you're in a space that's in the cloud and there's this broad sense of other applications that are available to you, you can just start using them, right? So the level of friction is really, really low.
Yeah, and that's a trend that we see as well, is that even if you're a company that's even if you're a company that's operating in the cloud, you may still have to go to another team in your company to request more EC2s, or you may have to go through budgeting. Or if your company's operating in the cloud, then you may still need to go to another team to request more servers, more EC2s. But the trend we've seen with serverless is that the adoption is just happening so quickly because there's just less friction internally within organizations to adopt it and to get things done.
Right. Yeah. And to a certain extent, you kind of mentioned budgeting, which tends to go with things like capacity planning. Others with serverless, far less capacity planning to deal with, right? You're not having to think about how long do I use it? How much do I have to buy? It just kind of takes care of it for itself. So yeah, that was an interesting trend. The other one, which kind of piggybacks on that, was, so, roughly 50% of EC2 users were using serverless. But closer to 80% of container users, so in particular kind of ECS users, but container users beginning to use serverless as well. So that is accelerated even more than just sort of the VM use case, which I assume, and I'd be curious if I'm wrong on this, or your take is, if you've sort of made the leap to containers, you're sort of in the path of developing microservices as opposed to maybe monoliths. So the leap then to functions isn't nearly as big.
Yeah, so people are already thinking about running in terms of microservices. So for new services that teams are writing, it's easy for a team to use a serverless function technology because it just fits into this broader microservice where you just have a contractual API with other people consuming your microservice. And so it doesn't matter to those other teams or to your own team how something is actually implemented. So there's a lot of adoption here.
Right.
And we see a big trend as well in these being used in parallel. So it's not like services that are the EC2 services that talk to each other, it's not the ECS services that are talking together and the Lambda services that are operating independently. We see them really being adopted together, and sometimes it's a legacy service that's being moved to Lambda, or it's Lambda functions talking to containerized or host-based infrastructure, or even on-prem infrastructure. It's just very easy to make all of these pieces fit together.
Right. Yeah, no, it is really fascinating to sort of watch the correlation between things, and once people, like we mentioned earlier, kind of get used to operating in the cloud, how do you, what does your growth curve look like? So we've talked a lot about kind of, the languages, the runtimes, the actual compute around serverless. Let's talk a little bit about the things that are then driving the usage of serverless, which is, there's always two pieces to it. There's the compute and kind of execution, and then there's the events that trigger it. The report does a really nice job of starting to break down what events are kind of correlated to this, where they're used in conjunction with it. Talk a little bit about some of the top kind of event sources that are being used with serverless.
If you've used Lambda before, the top ones aren't too much of a surprise. So we've seen a lot of usage of API Gateway and DynamoDB as probably the most popular technologies used with Lambda for AWS serverless users. But when we break it down into these event-driven architectures, which is by far what we see is the most common type of infrastructure people are running, we're seeing people using message queues. So we saw SQS as the most popular when we broke down our data by the number of organizations using them with Lambda. But we see a surprising amount of Kinesis and SNS usage as well. And so that's so that developers who are making a call from one Lambda to another are putting a message onto a queue and doing an asynchronous invocation that way. And so this is as opposed to in a microservice architecture, maybe you have HTTP-based microservices and you're making blocking calls from one service to another. People are to embrace serverless and the whole pay for what you use philosophy around it, people are making their Lambdas as small as possible and execute as quickly as possible, and then taking advantage of message queues as a delivery mechanism between them.
Yeah.
And as for actual data stores, so we're seeing a lot of serverless data stores being adopted here as well. So this is stuff like DynamoDB. We're also seeing a lot of just SQL-based databases. So people aren't necessarily moving over to a NoSQL database, but they're continuing to use RDS, Aurora Serverless, and even on-prem or self-hosted databases as well.
Yeah, no, and I think that's interesting because the thing that you start to get when you're able to break down kind of the connection between these two is, on one hand, your developers are focused on, okay, I want to write smaller code. I want to start thinking about, how do I break that up, like you said, with step functions. But it also can inform the rest of the team as to, hey, what are the most common things they're using them with? And, do we need to augment our experience with Kinesis? Do we need to augment our experience with DynamoDB? Do we need to think about how we monitor those things? Is there a little bit more we can squeeze out of them? So, having the connection between not just, hey, a lot of people are using functions, but what are they using them with? Really, I think should help teams have a better understanding of what do they do, how can they improve, are there areas that they need to think about a little bit more. The last thing I want to kind of hit on is kind of in your day-to-day role. So you collect the information, data is always great, and then at some point you go, but what do we do with it, right? And so I would imagine as a product manager, you're looking at this saying, given this sort of newer set of insights, was this about what you expected? Are there some new things in there that you then sort of translate into, hey, from a monitoring perspective, from a cost guidance perspective, what you can do to sort of help customers? How do you think about it in terms of not just collecting information, but how you can give something back to make your customers or end users' life better or more visible?
The data is really interesting as a product manager because it helps us make more data-informed decisions. Mm-hmm. So we talk to a lot of customers, we go to a lot of events, and we hear, I'm using AppSync, and I want, and I find it difficult to debug when my resolver has a bug in it. And so we hear stories like that, and then going from that to actually data to prioritize what we work on is super helpful now. And so what we're really looking at is how can we support the entire serverless ecosystem? Because it's more than Lambda, it's more than DynamoDB, and it's more than even just AWS. And we're really looking at how we can support all of this together. And so this is everything from a performance perspective to a deployment perspective. Customers want visibility into all of this. We're really looking at what tools are people using, what products are people using, and what are the trends in serverless development in general.
Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense. And it was kind of, I was asking you, and then we kind of highlighted a little bit earlier. There's a part of this that you can look at and say, okay, maybe a lot of this is AWS centric, but if you're not using AWS, can you correlate it? And I think if I was somebody taking a look at the report or even talking to you guys, I want to be able to go, okay, maybe we're going to use Azure, right? For whatever reason, we're going to use a different cloud. Can we apply sort of similar type of logic that you would use to think about, hey, how do we deploy this better? How do we monitor it better? So it is, to me, it's always really interesting. Like you said, you want data-driven decisions. You kind of have some gut feel of things from having talked to the market or attending events and so forth. But it's always good to get these types of reports that come out, whether they're quarterly or every 6 months or once a year, that A, validate maybe what our thoughts are, and then B, sometimes just the magnitude of what you see is really interesting. One last question before I let you go. Anything in this that kind of jumped out at you that you were like, oh, wow, that really was outside of what we sort of had perspective on this, a number, a usage rate, a size of customer, whatever it might be, anything that really kind of surprised you?
Yeah, so I think we're still surprised at the size of organizations that are adopting serverless and the problems that they're solving with it. Because typically we see serverless get into an organization for their security teams wanting to set up routine jobs that are being triggered by events or being triggered on a schedule to sort of check that certain things are compliant. But it's really gone beyond that, and we're seeing it in all kinds of technology that we use every day. And then from an engineering perspective, a really interesting trend we're seeing is that not many developers are defining concurrency limits on their functions, meaning that if that function receives a lot of traffic, it could actually run much farther behind schedule than you would expect. And that can actually impact other functions in your AWS account because this concurrency limit is sort of this shared pool with other functions. And so a recommendation we make to our customers typically is that it's a very good practice to define some kind of concurrency limit on functions and to at least monitor it so you know when something's happening, because it can lead to some odd behavior when you haven't taken that into account for downstream services as well.
Gotcha. No, and that makes a lot of sense. I think your last point about people are beginning to use it. They're beginning to see usage of it. It's starting to make sense for the business. And then maybe sometimes you haven't necessarily thought about as an end user, you may not have thought about kind of all the failure scenarios or runaway scenarios, and those are the ones that sometimes will kind of bite you. Maybe you get a bigger bill than you expected, or like you said, the response time to an application is slower than expected, and you'll hear about it from your customers. So yeah, I think that follows the natural maturity curve of explore the technology, begin to use the technology, and then figure out how to optimize it. So very, very cool. Well, Stephen, I want to wrap it up with that. If somebody wants to kind of reach out to you and kind of dig into these types of things, what might be a good way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, Twitter's a great way. I'll see notifications on there. I'm SPNKTN.
All right. Excellent. Well, with that, folks, I want to thank Stephen so much for the time today. I think, the report does a really nice job of digging into a lot of different facets of serverless, from, types of business users, so you get a sense of the market, really digging into how it's used, and hopefully, as you're looking at it, maybe as somebody evaluating the technology or using it, some ways to optimize it for yourself. So with that, Stephen, thank you so much for the time today. Folks, we're going to wrap it up. As always, thank you for listening to the show. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for rating it on iTunes and other places where you listen to the podcast. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.